Whoa, crash as soon as we start. Oh,
Start with a
well.
bang.
This
Welcome to
is,
LYLAS. I got to come up with a new tagline. I feel like I say the same thing every time. Like, if you grew up in the 90s, you probably know what that stands for. And this is the right podcast for you, especially if you're a female, but we love our gentlemen as well. We know we've got some male listeners out there. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the LYLAS
absolutely.
podcast. We got a fun topic today. And sometimes I make notes, sometimes I don't. But today's notes I just showed Sarah. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll show the camera as well. But it's just a blank page with a title that says adult ADHD. And if that doesn't wrap me up in a nutshell, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I have a lot of ideas. They just don't always make it to paper. They just stick right up wheeling around in my head. And classic. That's classic Jenny right there. So we're winging it per usual. Don't know what's going to come out of my mouth because I don't have a filter. But we're going to talk all things adult ADHD as it relates to the two of us, two diagnosed adults with ADHD, and
Mhm.
kind of give our stories as far as how we got here, how we somehow are functioning adults in society with careers and children and families and all the things that come with that, but also to just some of the things that work for us that help keep us on track and help us to be as successful as we have been. So
Mhm.
we're going to share some of that today.
Yeah, and hopefully that'll also, like, if you have this condition or suspect that you do, then it'll be, again, the purpose of this to be validating, informative, and fun because you got to find some humor in some of this. But also, if you have kids that have this condition, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean that
Right.
they can't get advanced degrees or, be successful in other areas of life. It just means that we have to be very strategic a lot of times in how we go about doing this. And so as a full wraparound, there's your piece for the current as well as for the future on how this can kind of turn out. So
I've disclosed to a lot of parents over the years when I was sitting across the table from them, and we were talking ADHD and what they were going to do as far as were they going to seek medication or whatever. We were just always having these conversations because a lot of school age children get diagnosed, and I would always fully disclose and say, I'm an adult, I have it, I've been on medication for a long time. It certainly helps me. It's not for everyone, and I think it is important to know that there are a litany of different types of ADHD medications out there. And sometimes it's a lot of trial and error, like with anything, but it's not for everyone. And I think sometimes kids are misdiagnosed, and that, certainly you're not going to want to put a kid on. It's not going to be the first thing you run to. You're going to try some things, hopefully, first, but we'll sort of get into that. But, a lot of times parents they had a really negative view of ADHD. Maybe they were diagnosed as a kid and they were put on medication. They just had a really terrible experience. And so they were very resistant to it, or they just didn't want that label put on their kid. Either way, also fair. Nobody likes a label.
mhm.
But I think it's important to recognize if you do exhibit certain characteristics that are in alignment with this diagnosis, to recognize that about yourself and then take some steps to help you be successful, because it can be extremely frustrating if
Mhm.
you maybe have never been diagnosed and you've struggled with these symptoms for a long time. um, I know I definitely was not diagnosed as a young child. I, the more that I learned about it through my graduate training, I certainly saw it very clearly. I don't know how it was missed, but I think to that point, like, we all develop coping skills,
Mhm.
and I definitely developed coping skills, and I was always able to sort of slide under the radar and get through and finish through most of my school without any kind of medication. But then you know, once things got difficult and projects got involved and things that really require a lot of planning and organization, that's a struggle for me. And so that's really where medication is super helpful.
Mhm.
So,
I
yeah.
had no idea that you had ADHD as a kid. Like you told me that and I'm like, "Really?" Like it just
Everybody
wasn't
see,
apparent.
well, I think so many, especially in females,
Mhm.
everyone thinks it's the hyperactive kid bouncing around the room, where it can be, that
Mhm.
can be one of them. They used to, in the DSM, it used to be divided into ADHD and ADD, and they sort of just combine the two. And you're ADHD inattentive type or hyperactive or both combined.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I was always the inattentive type. Like I'm always in my head. I'm always thinking about something else. I can be having a conversation with somebody and thinking about something completely different. I could sit in a classroom and stare at the teacher and take notes or appear to be and be having a totally different conversation with with myself in my head or thinking about something else. So I'm definitely more of the inattentive type. And I think that people often just misread or don't pick up on it in females. With boys, it tends to be a little bit more obvious.
No, I think the research would also support that as being true, and it was probably definitely reflective in each of our experiences with it. I feel like that my learning disability was abundantly clear.
Fair.
Not only because I was in like these split like IEP classes, but I think that served as the kind of precedence, which is why like me swirling around and always kind of buzzing was just not even a part of the picture, because the other was just so severe, just in terms of being completely dyslexic. Again, very challenging for me to do many things, but I think that through learning about how to manage and work with that, I was more able to combat some of the experiences with the attention piece of this, or just the buzz that just permeates around.
Or
So.
it wasn't the primary issue.
Mm-mm,
The learning piece of it was maybe the bigger issue for you, and so maybe not focus so much on the inattentiveness or hyperactivity that you were experiencing.
Yeah, I was able to kind of like keep that under control as much as what I could, mainly because I had my experience with it is that my mom's a teacher, my grandmother's a teacher, my stepmom's a teacher. I was surrounded by educators and like super smart people that were like, well, they just always knew I had to be entertained. Like my dad's favorite saying about me is that as a child, she just always had to be entertained. And as long as she was entertained, she was fine. But I could also self entertain. Like I can sit there and make just random things up to do all day long. But that was helpful, I think, in my development, is that they were attuned to what was going on, able to help at home and teach strategies to kind of help, so that way it didn't blow up to a point where it was incredibly disruptive, I think.
Well, and I think it's like any other disorder. We all have symptoms, right? We all have like certain characteristics. Like, autism is one that often gets thrown out, and people tend to think of them as a person with autism as being pretty rigid in like their daily routines. And if their routine gets messed up, it highly affects them. It can cause like emotional outbursts. I'm very much that way. I am very much routine. Like I like my routine. And if you interrupt my routine or if you change something that I'm expecting to happen, I struggle with that emotionally. But that doesn't mean I have autism. That means that I have that one characteristic that is similar to that diagnosis. A lot of times people struggle with focusing, if you haven't slept in a while, or so many things can affect our attention. But there are other characteristics, and it's really about meeting several of those characteristics in order to receive a formal diagnosis. And then it's like anything else, there's a continuum. It might severely impact you, or it might not have much of an impact. You might have the disorder, but you're able to manage it through different techniques. And so I think just realizing that for me as a kid, when I think back, I'm like, I was really, I was a smart kid and I picked up on things fairly quickly. I could complete my work, especially when it was like rote, simple tasks. I could, snap right through those. It's when we got into the older grades where it was like projects. I mean, the death of me. Like all my friends were in honors classes. So I took honors classes and we had summer reading to do. Well, I was the queen of waiting till 72 hours before school started to begin my summer reading projects, and I luckily had very smart friends that did their work and often helped me through those 72 hours so that I would have something to turn excuse me, to turn in that first day of school. So I had coping skills. I had great friends that were very helpful to me.
Mhm.
Um, but, and I was able to pass along. I was not a straight A student, but I made it and I got out and I got accepted to college and I did okay in the beginning. That's not true. I almost failed out of college. And then I was like, all right, it's time to take this seriously. Like, this is a real issue for me. And so
Mm.
I, then went and decided to trial medication. And from there on out, I was a 4.0 student, president's list the rest of my college career. So for me, I know it makes a huge difference in completing those types of like long term tasks where you really have to break things down. I get easily overwhelmed if I'm, given a lot of information at one time or a lot of information on one page. I really struggle with that. And so, I've learned over the year how I had to learn how to study for things because I just had never really developed any of that skill set. And so I've done a lot of things. I think medication was a helpful piece, but it's other things too. You have to have some behavior training as well and really train yourself on what works for you, and how you can be successful in completing those tasks. And then when it came to my career, obviously when you're pregnant and breastfeeding, you can't take stimulant medication. And so I would go off of it and I would really rely heavily on the practices that I already had in place, those behavioral practices.
Mhm.
I'm certainly better at my job when I'm on medication. Like there, you could poll almost anybody I've ever worked with, and they would tell you that. Um, I'm better with timelines and time management and follow through and all of those things when I take medication, and that's sometimes hard for me to admit. I don't
Mhm.
like to admit that I benefit from this medication, but at the end of the day, it is what it is, and I picked a career that is full of timelines and long term projects and things that require you to be super organized. And, it's just not my strengths. And so it does help me to achieve those goals
Mhm.
in that setting.
No, that's cool though. I think it's neat that you chose a career that may not play to those strengths, but you found ways to, again, using the phrase like level up to be where you're able to function brilliantly within that setting. So,
Yeah, I think I picked the career because I could relate to kids that struggled in school and
mhm.
like struggled not obviously, and so I really always just wanted to work with kids and be that support person for them and help navigate and help their parents navigate the whole process because
Mhm.
I personally was never in any kind of like any special
Mhm.
services or had any kind of like accommodation plan, although I think I could have benefited from one. But I never, that was just not something that I had. So I do think that it would have helped me in some ways, but also somehow it turned out okay. And I've had a,
Mhm.
thriving career at this. I'd like to think that I've helped some kids along the way and that, and parents too, to help them wrap their mind around it, just being like, that your child reminds me of myself at that age. And
Mhm.
it's not a death sentence. It's
Mm-mm.
just you've got to be willing to work with it and work with some support people and help get them on the right track. And there's so many things that you can do to help you function
Yeah.
with this adult or childhood disorder.
Mhm. And I think it's fair too that a lot of times we don't even notice that it manifests until we do get into those later stages in life, and then it's
Mhm.
shocking that we start to struggle, and then it's hard for adults to get treated with this condition because of the
Mhm.
fact that the stimulant medication is heavily abused, and every state has its own regulatory practices um, about how it's able to be prescribed, and it does make it a treatment challenge, I think, if you are an adult that struggles with this from that
Absolutely.
perspective.
Absolutely. I think that there are many people that kind of notice these things and kind of have a history about it, and then they're ready to address it. And they go to the doctor and they get treated almost like they're a drug addict seeking
Mhm.
drugs. And that's also super frustrating. I've felt that way before when, seeking treatment about anxiety or depression, whatever it is. There's just like this, and it's because people have abused it in the past. And that's fair that doctors are trying to weed that out. I mean, I think that's part of their job, but to make someone feel a certain way when they're seeking help, is also to be on the receiving end is really difficult. And I think a lot of people shy away from it. It's also just the pain in the ass, if I'm quite honest, like to go to
Mm-hmm.
the doctor every 3 months to get the pre-authorization from your insurance to then, drop off your prescription. Everything has to be done. Like nothing can just be like called in.
Right.
Everything they have to verify. My husband can't pick it up. I have to pick it up. Like it's very heavily controlled, like you said. And then
Mm-hmm.
it's also difficult because a lot of times they're out of the medication,
Yeah.
especially around the beginning of school or things like that, when everybody's getting their kids' prescriptions refilled. It's sort of what led me to trial some different stimulant medication recently. When I went off of everything back in like June of 2022, I went off of all medications for a year and then went back to the doctor when I was going to go back to work. And we had a long conversation. I said, I just really don't love the side effects of Adderall. Like, I'm just over it. And sure, everybody likes the 5 pounds you lose at the beginning when you first start taking it. It does completely take your appetite away. But all those things come back. Your appetite comes back. You still have to learn to manage your weight. It's not a weight loss drug, but it does have other side effects. Your stomach is upset. You get a lot of headaches. You get when you're coming down from it. At least for me, these are all personal side effects that I experienced. A lot of moodiness and easily irritated. And I have young kids, and that's just not who I'm trying to be. I don't want to be irritated at 5 o'clock every day. And so we talked a lot about that. And so she started me on a newer medication, something called Astaris, which is like a time release stimulant medication. And it is very different from Adderall. I would say very different, but in a lot of good ways. Like I didn't experience any of the side effects at all. I'm not, it's any kind of stimulant is going to make you focus on whatever you're doing. So it's not going to make you do your job. If you focus on playing solitaire, like if you're playing solitaire and you take your medication, you're going to play solitaire for like 8 to 12 hours. Like you go down a tunnel. So you still have to have those behavioral practices in place of like, I've taken my medication, it's time to shift into work mode. And so anyway, I really have been pleased with the change in medications, but part of that just comes to just talking to your doctor and being really open about these things, and being willing to try things if that's what you're looking for, if that's the route you're trying to go to help with your symptoms.
Yeah, and those are good points with it. And two, even if you do go through your primary care physician or even through a psychiatrist, it's also important to note that a lot of times they'll require you to go through testing in order to really kind of tease some things out, and that can be another. It's helpful information, but it can also serve as a barrier to care.
Yeah, because they
And
will, even if you like, I went off of it for a year, I had to go back through the testing again, and you have to take a drug test, and they
mm-hmm.
have a lot of, um, just part of the process, a lot of things you have to go through, and it helps them sort of weed out, I think, in some ways, like who's just seeking medications for certain reasons. But they make you go through it. And I always get irritated. I'm like, can't you look at my chart and see that I've been on the same medication for 25 years? Like, can we like speed the process up? And they're like, no, we can't. And that's okay. I have to respect that too, that they have a procedure that or a protocol that they follow, and that they're not trying to get in trouble either, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or have their license taken away. So, important thing to note, we are not seeking to give medical advice on this podcast. We are just giving our personal experiences with something that we both have lived with. We both deal with it very differently. And so if you are someone who is suffering from symptoms that we talk about today, reach out to your medical professional and get a true evaluation for a diagnosis. Don't ever self-diagnose. That's honestly one of my pet peeves, is when people say I have this or have that and they actually don't. Or they've just never, you might have it, but you've never formally been diagnosed with it. I think it's always important to go through the process and actually have a trained professional look at you and look at your list of symptoms and then talk about what your options are. So that's a little CYA, but again, we are not here to give medical advice.
No, and I do 100% agree with that. And this whole like TikTok doc thing where everybody's just like, oh my gosh, this is me and this is what I sound. And now we start to identify as these diagnoses that we've never
Yeah.
actually been evaluated by a professional or treated for. Do not become that person.
Or we start diagnosing other people.
Yeah,
Like
no.
that's the new thing, like narcissist. I don't know, you open up any ad or any social media and it's all
Mhm.
about narcissist, and all of a sudden we're anybody that's ever wronged you, you're calling them a narcissist all of a sudden. You know, these are like heavy labels that we put on people. Bipolar, that's a big one.
Mhm.
People used to say that, oh, he's bipolar, she's bipolar, not even knowing what those symptoms are, what that
Yeah.
actually looks like, how difficult of a disorder that is to manage,
Mhm.
to outright just call people these things without having any true credibility to be able to do that is just wrong, in my opinion. And we've
Yeah.
got to stop doing it, because that's also why people don't seek help for these
Right.
disorders, because we have made it a game of just throwing around these labels.
Yeah. And I think that maybe the intention is to try to destigmatize some of this, but actually you're just creating a worse problem for it. And
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that because it does warrant some mindfulness to those traps that we can all kind of get stuck in with it. So, yes, very good
Yeah.
aside.
You're very different with how you manage your ADHD, and I would love for our listeners to hear, because Sarah is she is Miss Thing. I mean, she has been, you know, Mrs. United States. She has been Mrs. West Virginia. She has
Yeah.
been a successful doctor of psychology. Like, she has
Mm.
had quite the track record. She's had an amazing career. She's very um, what's the word I'm looking for? You're just very like almost shy about talking about all of your accomplishments, but you've done
Mm.
some pretty fantastic things in your life.
Mm.
And you, to my knowledge, you've never taken any
Mm-mm.
kind of stimulant medication to help you with your symptoms. And so, talk a little bit about what you do on a daily basis to help manage yourself, your life, your symptoms, all the things.
All the fun stuff, right? Well, kind of very similar to Jen. I think that we both had separate but equally challenging struggles as kids, and mine was definitely the bigger piece was the learning disability.
Sure.
And so, as Jen was even talking about doing the summer reading projects, I was in the honors and AP classes and things, but my literally, my dad would read aloud to me the summer reading project books while we were driving to New York or going on a trip or doing whatever it is that we were doing. As soon as I was able to drive, he would be in the passenger seat reading the entire time. God bless the man because he loves to read anyway. So it wasn't like a torturous act for him, but that's the way that I got through at least those summer reading based kind of projects. And then using Audible Cliff Notes back in the day was a really helpful tool and a study piece for me. But it really came down, I think, again, to having a group full of educators as parents or people who were knowledgeable about those types of things, and then really focused on developing schedules and routines. And I'm a big schedule and routine person. And Jen was talking kind of playfully about her list of notes and everything else. But you look at, I mean, you can't totally see it, but mine's full. But also on the side of it are little doodles that I'll sit here and doodle a lot of times, or you'll see me moving back and forth. And even behind me, I use like visual aids, I guess, or representations
Sure.
to kind of help keep me on track, not only throughout my day to day, but even in thinking about like a week or a month or at one point I had like 3 months worth of like points of transition because the schedules and routines would be so different that it was important for me to be effective to have a roadmap. And so that's the way that I kind of conceptualize um, my ability to get things done. It's kind of like I have a point A and a point B, and that there are destinations along the path that I need to make sure that I'm hitting in order to get to that point effectively. And I do a list every single day. And people are like, well, I would forget the list. This isn't the only list. There's also a list on my iPhone. And you're like, oh my gosh, that takes so much time. I feel like that I benefit the most from whenever I take a few minutes to slow down. So even though there's 10,000 things to do, I'm not going to be effective at doing any of them if I don't take a few minutes to slow down and then to kind of plan out what is going to happen. And I do that not with numbers, because again, if you're dyslexic or if you struggle with like math and like spelling and shit like that, then putting those things in front of you is just going to serve as a block, and it
Yeah.
stops. So if you write down number one and then you do your whole list of 10 or whatever it is and you're at three and you can't get past three, then you just quit on it. I don't do that. I do like little dashes, or that's what it is today. It's dashes. Sometimes it's dots, sometimes it's whatever. It's dashes on the board too. So I guess I'm being consistent with that. But it's not even in a necessary order. It's just written down. So that way
Yeah.
I know that I can get, once this is done, okay, well, this, and now I have X amount of time to do this or that. Our school system, whenever we were kids, did not like it at the time, but it is a skill that I still use today. And technology's changed and people do things differently, but they had us use agendas, is what they called them.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
real word was planner.
Yeah.
And it was so helpful to have that, even though it was annoying. And I have to sign off on our daughter's agenda because they are still doing them here.
Wow.
Yeah, still. But it's helpful because it allowed me to get in the habit of scheduling and planning ahead. And
Mm-hmm.
so I got through undergrad in 3.5 years. If I would have went 4 years, I would have had a triple major. Um, but instead did I have a double major? I had a major and then I double minored, and no, it was a triple minor. It was whatever it was. And then I started grad school and then got my doctorate. And even throughout college, it wasn't as much of a struggle because I had the skill set developed. And for me, if I am able to get locked in on something, then I can again hone in, drive attention and everything into doing it. Now, I may be swirling around and doodling and, you know what I mean, having some other type of psychomotor activity kind of taking place while I'm doing it, but I'm able to kind of focus in at those types of points. And so for me, my, I guess, symptoms in that regard were never to the point of like dysfunction. They were maybe disruptive to those who were around me. Like my husband will see me and I'll just be like, he uses the word buzzing, that I'm just buzzing throughout the place. But I'm also to the point where if I have 2 seconds to do something, then I'm going to get it done. Like I'm not the person that pushes off, at least anymore. There was a period of time whenever I would put some things off, but if I have 2 seconds to get something done, then I'm getting it done. And then I'm moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And so that is one reason why I've never ventured into taking medication, is because, again, for me, it comes down to, is this dysfunctional within my abilities to get things done?
Yeah.
And it
Absolutely.
hasn't been. It has required a lot more thoughtfulness and, again, maybe planning and attention and silly graphs and charts and poster boards and
Other
different
coping skills.
other coping skills, other little tools here and there. But I do find that my threshold is as long as I'm still able to get things done, then I don't want to put on a medication because it just doesn't dictate it. You know what I mean?
Well,
There's no medical necessity is not, to use the terms, medical necessity is not being met for me
right.
because, again, and I am much less likely to be as bouncy, but I shift positions a whole bunch. And some of that's just, I think it's just because I get, I just have a lot of energy all the time,
Yeah.
all
That
the
comes
time.
out physically for you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot going on between my ears that comes out. I tend to talk a lot. And so when I take medication, I'm much quieter, much more reserved. It's a lot of my husband going, "Are you okay? Is something wrong?" No, I'm just, I just took my meds today, just quieter. Um, But yeah, I think you bring up a good point in that it's never caused such a dysfunction. Like you have been able to function and be successful without it. So you wouldn't add on that layer. I just see medication as being a layer of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
It is never going to fix anything. Like you can't just go on medication and expect to poof, everything's going to be great. You still
Yeah.
have to put a lot of these same practices in place. Like I'm a checklist person as well, particularly when I am working. I have a checklist every single day and I have to prioritize those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a job where I can kind of create sort of what my day looks like every day, but I know what has to get done based on timelines. We have 60-day timelines and you can't go over that 60 days. There's a lot that has to be done. And so for me, I'm the queen of procrastination. And so I have learned over the years to get the tough stuff out of the way first, the stuff I don't like to do, or the things that maybe are a little bit harder for me, like the report writing, just sitting down and staring at a blank screen, getting those done. If I get a head start on that from the get rip and get it started, it is so much easier for me to go in and plug in testing
Mm-hmm.
results, observations, those types of things later on within that timeline. And so you have to learn what works for you. And I think we're all so different. We can have the same disorder. I mean, you and I
Yeah.
have the same diagnosis, and we're so vastly different in how we handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think it just again, you've got to be willing to experiment and try different things. I very much rely on my peers, and like a peer buddy. Um, in college and graduate school, I've always had a friend with the same major. We're going through the same classes that we would study together because I almost needed someone to be like, Jenny, we're going to sit down from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and we're going to study. Bring your highlighters, your books. Like, we're going to do it. I needed that sort of like a beginning and an ending, like you're saying. You got to know that there's an ending to this, whatever
Mm-hmm.
you're about to embark on, unless it's something that's highly of interest to me. Now, if it's something highly interesting to me, then I can go down a rabbit hole for a long time and really engage in that. But if it's not interesting to me, then I really, really struggle with
Mm-hmm.
even like a movie. Like if I'm not into,
Yeah.
like I can't sit still and just watch a movie for the hell of it. Like my husband could do that.
Mm-mm.
He'll get to the end of a movie and be like, that was terrible. And I'd be like, how did you sit there for 2.5 hours if you thought that was terrible? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that. I'm like, I'm out of here. And so it has to be highly of interest for me to really sit and engage in something for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely medication helps me with that because there's always parts of our job that aren't highly interesting or engaging. And so that definitely helps me with those pieces as well. Particularly report writing, that's just so monotonous.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting for a long time at your desk, typing the same types of things over and over again. Any kind of paperwork, there's a lot of paperwork in my job, and that's always something that I sort of struggle with keeping up with if I'm not on medication.
Mm-hmm.
The other pieces of it, like the interaction, like I can do that with or without, but when it comes down to those types of things, I very much benefit from having something that sort of makes me focus and get it done. Otherwise, I'll put it off until day 59 and scrambling at the end. And I hate that. I hate being that person. And so I try really hard not to be. And
Oh.
part of that is just accepting it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's definitely true. And I think, gosh, as you were talking about that, I was thinking just about kids in general and about us. This is such an individual thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I would consider, if you're an adult who does struggle with this, to really just maybe take it like a day or two of just like, I don't know, self study and see what times of day you are most uh, alert, most attentive, most functional. Some people get up at 8 o'clock, whatever, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they're ready to go. And then other people, they're not awake and functioning until much, much later in the day. So, if you are a person with this, one thing that, again, I found helpful is that I'm attentive at certain parts of the day, really highly able to engage and to stay focused. And then at other points of the day, that train has left the station and pulling it back in is probably highly unlikely. And so
Yeah.
I try to, even in my days, schedule more I guess, kind of like cognitively based or other types of activities during the parts of the day that I know I'm going to be most attentive
Yeah.
or most likely to be able to um, be more focused or, just kind of planted, I guess, in a way. And that is also helpful for me. And then, two, if you watch me do things, I'm usually, again, there's a lot of motor activity, there's a lot of things happening. But as long as I am getting things done, that doesn't require me to stop doing something else. And I think sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with kids, we can kind of get caught in that trap. Like if a kid is sitting there and they've got the TV on or the music going and they're reading, we're like, you can't read while you have your television and your music on.
Yeah.
No, actually, that's the way that some people do process things. Or if you look at their notes and again, there's a whole bunch of doodles on it, you can look at that and say you weren't paying attention. I don't know that that's always the case. You can look through
Yeah.
tons of my stuff and see
All your
flowers.
doodles.
Oh my God, yeah. Cats, dogs, flowers, I don't know, sunshine, random stupid shit that I can just sit there, you know what I mean, and draw
And
with.
do.
Yeah, but I was a
And
4.0 student. So.
well, and it actually helps you focus in some of those ways.
Mhm.
I've had colleagues in the past, I've worked with teachers who doodle the entire time during staff meetings or during IEP meetings, and they're listening to every word that everyone's
Mhm.
saying. They just have to have that activity going. Or I had one colleague that did origami. And so he'd be over there making like
I love
tiny
it.
little, like, origami pieces and stuff. But again, like that was his way of sort of keeping his body occupied because
Mhm.
of all of that like stimulation and movement. And instead of just bouncing in his chair, he found a way to sort of channel that. And I think that's a great point. A lot of times we ask kids in the school system to sit for incredibly long amounts of time and go to a staff meeting and observe how many adults can sit still for an hour. It's back
Mhm.
to me. Like we would have staff meetings, and I just natural observer of behavior would be watching people in meetings, and like they're actively engaging in behaviors that they complain about students engaging in those same exact behaviors, because it is hard to sit still and focus. I don't care how old you are, it's even harder for young children to do that. And that
Mhm.
expectation that they're just going to sit and do everything that we expect them to do is unrealistic in many cases. A lot of kids have to, they might be standing up and writing things, or like you
Right.
said, you're more of an auditory person. I'm the opposite. I can't hear something and remember it, or like
Mhm.
someone reading instructions to me, you might as well light them on fire. Like I can't focus, I can't comprehend that way. I
Mhm.
have to read it myself or observe someone doing it. I'm really good if I can watch someone else do it, then I can do it. But I can't take in auditory information and process it the same way that other people do. And so just knowing yourself and knowing that that's not the way that you learn, that's not the way that you focus best, and giving that grace to kids as well. If you're, it's difficult for kids in this. If you have a child that is diagnosed with ADHD, school is probably very difficult for them,
Yeah.
because the expectations are just, it's,
It's a
it's
lot.
basically against all of these types of symptoms that they exhibit.
Mhm.
And so, especially if it's a hyperactive child, if it's an inattentive kid, they are probably flying under the radar to some degree.
Mhm.
If they're really struggling academically with like a learning disability as well. But for the most part, if you've got a hyperactive kid, school is just, they're going to tell you, third week of kindergarten, they don't like school
Mhm.
because it's
Mhm.
these rules, and they're being called out all the time for not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or being out of their seat, or for, talking too much, whatever it is. And so it's a lot of like negative reinforcement.
Yeah.
And it only takes a couple of weeks of someone telling you, stop doing that, do this,
Mhm.
why are you talking? Why are you, for a kid to be like, no, this ain't my jam. Like, can I go back to playing all day in preschool?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
it's pretty obvious, I think, in some cases for young kids. But to that point, too, some of them just have never been in school and they need to learn the routines and learn those things.
Yeah.
And so if you think that your child is struggling with these types of symptoms, always reach out to a pediatrician. And then if you do have a diagnosis, you can reach out to the school and get some support with their guidance counselors or their school psychologist. There's some things that we can always do within the school setting to sort of level that playing field and help them achieve at the same rate as their peers, and to make school fun and give them, they might need a task when they first walk in
Mhm.
day to sort of, like you said, to warm up. They can't just jump right in and sit down and do morning work. They might need to like take the lunch order down to the lunchroom or whatever.
Mhm.
Oh, I know that's kind of archaic now, but because everything's electronic, but sometimes we would just give kids blank notes to deliver to different teachers and just
Mhm.
give them a reason to get up and get some movement and exercise first thing in the morning. So always reach out. I always say start with a medical professional, because typically in the schools we cannot diagnose, and so you're going to want to start there and involve the school and let them give feedback on what they're seeing within that setting.
Mhm.
Typically, you will see these behaviors and symptoms exhibit across all settings, most
Mhm.
settings. Maybe not to the same degree, obviously, because you have different sets of expectations and home versus school and things like that. But you're going to notice these same types of issues across settings. So start
Yeah.
there, involve your school personnel, and then, come up with a plan to help support that child if they're really struggling or
Mhm.
being successful in school.
Yeah, and that's the best piece of advice to have with it. And again, I do believe that schools are very willing to work with kids because not only do they care and that's their job, but also they don't want it to be their job to be harder. And by offering the kind of help and skills, then it does ease everything to make it, much more of a healthy environment for all that are partaking in it. And
I
I don't
think
know.
you have a lot more educators that have been diagnosed at this point with things like
Mm-hmm.
ADHD or anxiety or depression, whatever, just a lot more that are working in the school system. And so they are way more open to working with kids because they can relate to them and they remember what that was like being a kid. And so they are, generally speaking, willing to work with the student. But you got
Mm-hmm.
to follow that process. It's like anything, you got
Yeah.
to follow the process. It's a pain in the ass, like everything.
Mm-hmm.
But once you do, it can be the difference between your child hating school and loving school.
Yeah.
I've got friends that were diagnosed as kids and put in all these different special classes, and I mean just hated school. And I've asked them, I'm like, what could your teachers have done differently? And they're like, I don't know. I just hated the whole thing. I hated everything about school. I was always told that I wasn't good enough or that I wasn't doing it right. And I think
Mm-hmm.
starting there, recognizing the language that we use with kids and helping them versus always pointing out how they are different from their peers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as you're sitting there saying this, I was like, okay, well, I was thinking about me as a kid because I'm more than certain that I would, not necessarily be bouncing off the walls because psychomotor activity, like the bounciness and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, does present different in girls than in boys. So we often don't get looked at that way. But for me, and to this day, I am still this person. If you are a psychologist and happen to listen to this podcast, you know that I'm very behavioral. I subscribe to the house of Watson and Skinner. Um, so cheers. But I would say that positive reinforcement was a huge, huge, huge thing for me. So if I knew that, if I were to sit still or to, stay on task or whatever the chore was at the point of time, and you don't have to, don't get, I was never a sweets kid, thank God, but I didn't need like a tangible thing to hold on to. I just needed a compliment. I just needed
Yeah.
somebody to say, and no one ever told me I was really doing anything bad or wrong. And maybe that was, part of it is that I just wanted to have that positive reinforcement, that positive attention fed to me. And so it was easier than for me to deal, I think, with some of those hardships or struggles, or to keep some of those more distracted, hyper-esque kind of behaviors under control, because I
Mhm.
knew that if I did, then somebody would say, hey, good job. And that to me was all I needed in order to kind of keep that under control, so to speak. And
Yeah.
then even later, as I got older, I got the gratification, not just from like having a teacher say that, because in college, that's,
Yeah. They're
that's
not
not likely to
giving you a
happen.
pat on the back.
Yeah, I mean, it happens sometimes, but it came from me seeing the grade that I was able to produce.
Yeah.
Or for me, again, going through hard things and with the intent on having a good finish, whatever that good finish translates to was always rewarding. And so
Yeah.
I've always kind of, my dad was real big into like that whole meditation, like Buddhist, like distress tolerance kind of stuff. So if you have to suffer a little bit to get through something, then it was worth it to me, because in some ways it requires more attention to get through hardships. It requires more effort. And if you have a different mentality set with it, instead of quit, but to go and dig, I think that also helped a ton whenever it came to managing other tasks or to just trying to make the grade or finish things. And then whenever I got into my career, I was in control.
Yeah.
And so and I will agree too that, and my patients who may listen to this, or former employees or whatever, my biggest stickling point was on schedules. Like everything would be fine with my day unless the schedule got off. And then that was not happening. But so much of what I did was a time-based service. It was a very different kind of clinical setting than what Jen worked in. And so it was important that things run timely. And that again, that structure fits well with me and my personality, but it also fit well from a clinical standpoint. Again, you can't be showing up late to, work every day and expect to have a job, or, dropping your kids
Right.
off 20 minutes late for school and not getting a call from a truancy person. But that did translate very heavily into my clinical practice and how I ran things. But that anytime that the schedule would get off kilter, it was
Not a fan.
not a
We're
fan.
so opposite in that way, and probably why we've both thrived in our different sectors of our careers, because mine was so flexible. My schedule was so flexible,
Mhm.
and that, like, if I had a child in crisis, I could spend a half a day with them, or, and I never wanted to put like an end point on, if I had a parent in and they were kind of like, spilling their guts and just they needed some like reinforcement or they needed some support. Like I wanted to be able to provide that to them. And I would not have done well in being like, well, your time's up. I have another appointment coming in. I'm going to need you to skedaddle. That's not how I operate. I'm very much like an emotional being. I definitely subscribe to like more of a cognitive behavioral theory, in that like if we can change our thoughts, we can change our behavior. And so I was just am much more of like a feelings, emotion kind of person, and a support in that way.
Mhm.
Here for you, and I'm not going to give you like a time slot. So that's probably why I'm not a therapist as well, because I'm pretty terrible at therapy. The one course that I had in therapy, just not my forte, counseling of any kind. But I liked the flexibility in my schedule, and that like truly every day was like a blank sheet. I had to look at my files, what I had on tap for the next 2 months, and then make my to-do list from that. So I really enjoy the flexibility that comes with being a school psychologist in that regard. I would
Yeah.
hate for someone to set my schedule. Like if someone was like, hey, here's your schedule for the day, I would be like, hell no. Like I'm going to tell you what my schedule looks like today. I mean, I would always take feedback. If somebody's like, I need you to do this, great. I can get that done. But I would not do well with someone dictating what my day looks like.
Yeah, that's a hardship. I think that's I felt like I was, I dictated what hours I worked, and so that was fine. And even though I conceptualize things, I think a lot of times from that behavioral standpoint. I mean, agenda setting is a part of CBT. You know what I mean? Working,
Yeah.
problem solving, doing all those things is a part of that clinical application of things. But it was also very, very timely. Like, and everybody knew it. Like, so it just worked out well for me and for the practice that I was running. But it's not for everybody.
To
But
be fair, those agendas you were talking about in high school,
mhm.
like same thing. I mean, I'm still old school. I still live and die by my agenda. I have by like my paper one. I would love to be able to look at everything on my
Still
calendar,
here. Mm-hmm.
on my phone calendar, but like I can't. I have to visually see it. I have to write it down. I have to
Mm-hmm.
see it over and over. I have a big calendar on the side of my refrigerator that I refer to all the time. Drives my husband crazy because he's very much a techie Did you put it on the family calendar? And I'm like, no, it's on the big calendar stuck to the side of our refrigerator. That's what I call the family calendar.
Right.
We're just very different in that. But also, too, like I see things wrong all the time. I'll get times wrong. I showed up for an appointment yesterday at 11:20. The appointment was at 12:20. Like I do things like that all the time. And so for me, if I don't have it written down on a task list or on a agenda on some sort of calendar, like it's gone in 30 seconds. Like I just do not retain information that way.
Yeah.
People are like, can you do this? And I'm like, let me write that down, because if it doesn't get down, I can guarantee you that's not going to happen.
Yeah. No.
I'm not going to remember. So, yes, those agendas were helpful. And I'm glad to hear that they are still utilizing those, because I found mine not too long ago and was going back through it. And it's probably one of those coping skills that helped me get through high school and be somewhat successful. Somehow by the grace of God, I got accepted to college and was able to do well enough. But
we all made it.
Things like that, knowing your strengths and then getting support for those weaknesses.
Yeah. And again, too, if you have those kids that go through this, attention is attention, whether it's positive or negative. It's always reinforcing. And there's superpowers. And there's this guy that I would know, I was just bashing like TikTok and stuff, but there's a person that he's not a prescriber. He's a person with ADHD that talks about the superpowers that come with being more just distracted and aware of your environment, because you are aware of things too. And I think that that's helpful, but to just, again, focus on the positive reinforcement that can come and what strengths are there. And if you're an adult with this, communicating with your partner, and you guys hear me talk about this, always communicate with your partner on things, because it's really, really important. Because again, it looks like I'm just, buzzing or not relaxed, which can be unsettling. If he's sitting there on the couch chilling out, working across a crossword puzzle, which he is, and he sees me just running back and forth from room to room, it's probably not as relaxing of an environment. He's like, why can't you just sit down and sit still? And I'm like, oh, well, we know, so I'm good. Yeah. This is relaxing to me to be doing this. Right. But having those conversations, figuring out what works best for you and your relationships, your career, or whatever, can just be very beneficial, I think. So
I think there's a lot of superpowers that come with it. And I think a lot of parents sometimes are afraid that you're going to stifle some of those characteristics if you choose to put your child on medication. And I think that's a valid point, because I've definitely seen kids that were way over medicated, like almost like zombies. And parents would say that, I don't want my kid to be a zombie. And I'm like, your kid doesn't have to. I mean, again, these are all conversations that you have with your medical professional, and you talk about, this is what I don't want. This is what I do want. Is this the right thing? And dose it. You've got to play with things until you find what works for you. And every single person is different. Every child is different. And so I just think that you have to be very mindful of that you're going to have to embark sort of on this journey to find what works best for the person that is being treated. So I completely understand when people are like, I don't want my kid to be a zombie. I agree. I think that we are very creative beings. I think that our minds go 1,000 miles a minute. And so we're always thinking and coming up with ideas. We have kind of a running joke in our family. I'm the idea man. My husband makes it happen because he's going to follow through, and the artistic ability and skills. We do big like Halloween costumes, and I think of it, and then he and his mom make them. It's how we work. He's great at putting a process into place or come up with like a process. And that's kind of where my skill set stops. I can create and think of things all day long, but then the follow through piece is really tough for me. I'm like, I had this great idea for a costume one time. It never happened because I didn't do anything. But it was a great idea, we have lots of great ideas. We have, I think we're very empathetic people. We're very good at tapping into our intuition and really trusting ourselves and our gut. And that can be hard for some people to really tap into that. But I know I have a very strong intuition, and I really appreciate that about myself. I think that that's just an important characteristic to have. And so we've got lots of superpowers. I don't ever want it to come off as a negative disorder. I don't even like saying the word disorder. I mean,
I use condition, yeah.
condition.
Condition.
We're not
Softer.
neurotypical. We're different. Our brains are wired different. Emotional beings. I really struggle with controlling my emotions. I'm no filter, as my husband also likes to say. Um, that definitely used to get me in trouble when I was a kid. I would say things like in front of somebody's mom, and my friend would be like, "Why did you say that in front of my mom?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Things just come out of my mouth. I don't understand. How do you not say things when you think them?" But
yeah.
Some of those things can sometimes bite you in the ass too if you're not careful.
No, I spent a lot of time in ALC in high school. Do you remember what that was? It was the old
in school suspension.
Yeah, it was in school suspension. It was called the Alternative Learning Center. Yeah, and so yeah, my mouth would get me in constant trouble, and I would get kicked out of my activities if I was suspended, and so they would always, well, you can, go to after school or be suspended or have ALC, and every time I'd go for ALC, I'd be in there for like a week. Just hanging out in a room with a bunch of other people. I had to even like dissect a worm or a frog in ALC because I got kicked out of my AP humanity or whatever it is. Not what was that? Not
it was humanities.
Yeah, it was one of those classes that human anatomy and physiology. Kicked out of it. I didn't get kicked out of it from that class. It's always the history classes or the ones that involve like debate or something else like that always got me in trouble. So spent a lot of time there. That might have been an area they probably should have been like, but they saw it as a behavior, I think, instead of like impulsivity. You know what I mean? Which it probably was, to be honest. I mean, hell.
Well, I mean, it is a behavior, but it's maybe not something that you necessarily can control, that whole impulse control.
No, I got a little, I don't even know if I've gotten better at it. Probably not. No, it's still there.
But
I'm just not getting.
You're also pretty good at like task initiation. Yeah. Whereas I'm not good at initiation.
Oh, I got all kinds of shit done. My entire week, they'd have it done in a day. Whenever I'd sometimes just want ALC just to like get ahead on stuff. I'd be like, man, if I just, this would bad. I would say something that I knew I shouldn't say and they'd give me ALC, but then I'd be able to get, like, if they assign like a huge humanities project that I had to sit there and do like a bunch of research or writing with, I could get all that stuff done in one day and then just sit around and read the newspaper.
Well, okay. We're here for helpful tips, not for how to cheat the system.
No, didn't work. That's true.
Hey, hopefully this has given you some insight. If you've got a child that struggles with ADHD or you yourself, you think possibly, if it is impacting you or you're not able to function, then always seek some guidance from your medical professionals. And there's lots of options out there. It doesn't have to, be disorder. It doesn't have to be incompetence. It doesn't have to look lazy. I hate when people say that, but there's so many things that you can do to help combat your symptoms. So reach out and get some support from your medical professionals. In the meantime, check us out on our website at LYLASpodcast.com. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook. I'd love to hear your feedback and comments. If you yourself struggle with ADHD, what are some of the things that you use to help keep you on track? I would love to hear that. And just, I feel like there will be a part 2 for this topic just because I'm now, of course, I can think of 100 other things to talk about that we don't have time to cover. But I would love to circle back at some point and just hear some of the other things that people use. Our peers are some of our greatest teachers in life. And so I would love to hear how other people manage their symptoms.
My stuff. Yeah, it's been fun. And, I guess now we'll get back to our little list that we have going on.
Yes, I need to make a list. I actually got a lot accomplished this morning, but I need to make my afternoon list. So anyway, let's get to it. I got to go pick up my meds. Speaking of which, they just called me to tell me they're in. So anyway, catch us on our social media channels. Until next week, LYLAS.
I'll see ya.